Bloodstains don't wash out of Italian marble. They seep into the porous veins, leaving a permanent shadow that scrub brushes and industrial bleach can never quite erase. Victor knew this better than anyone, considering he built his legitimate corporate empire directly on top of those shadows. So when his notoriously inept maid shattered a crystal bourbon decanter over his imported office rug, he didn't just fire her. He threw her out into the freezing city rain. He didn't know she was the only thing keeping the wolves at the door. Victor rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar, rhythmic throb of a migraine pulsing behind his right eye. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, distorting the neon glow of the city below into a smeared, abstract painting. It was past midnight. The rest of Russo Logistics had gone home hours ago, leaving only the security detail in the lobby, and him. And her. A sharp, metallic clatter echoed from the far corner of the room. Victor didn't even flinch. He just exhaled a long, tired breath. "Sorry," a quiet voice murmured. "Sorry, Mr. Russo. The duster caught the edge of the brass lamp." Chloe. She had been on the payroll for 3 months, hired by the agency his head of household management used, and she was without a doubt the most uncoordinated human being Victor had ever encountered. She tripped over the fringes of carpets. She knocked over wastebaskets. She seemed to exist in a perpetual state of nervous apology, her oversized grey uniform swallowing her small frame, her dark hair always falling out of its messy bun. "Just leave it, Chloe," Victor said, his voice flat. He didn't look up from the leather-bound ledger on his desk. This wasn't a standard corporate spreadsheet. It was the physical record of the port shipments, the real ones. The containers filled with untraceable firearms heading for the northern border. "I can fix it," she stammered, the rustle of her uniform indicating she was scrambling on the floor. "I'll just dust the baseboards over here." Victor ignored her, dragging a heavy pen down the column of numbers. The tension in his neck was unbearable. The Northern Syndicate, a ghost faction of the old Falcone family, had been making quiet moves against his shipping lanes. 2 of his lieutenants had gone missing in the last month. Nobody heard a thing. They just vanished. He was bleeding territory, and he couldn't find the source of the leak. He reached for his coffee mug. Empty. Before he could even hit the intercom, Chloe was there, a fresh, steaming mug in her trembling hand. She always seemed to know when he needed it, which was her only saving grace. "Careful," he warned, finally looking up at her. She had pale skin and dark, exhausted eyes that darted away from his the second they made contact. She smelled faintly of cheap lemon polish and rain. "Yes, sir, I've got it." She didn't have it. As she leaned over the massive mahogany desk, the heel of her scuffed sneaker caught the thick cable of his desk phone. She stumbled forward. Time seemed to slow down. Victor watched, paralyzed by pure, cynical inevitability, as the ceramic mug tipped over. Boiling black coffee surged over the rim like a tidal wave. It didn't hit the floor. It didn't hit the empty space of the desk. It landed directly, squarely on the open ledger. The dark liquid instantly saturated the thick, porous paper, obliterating the ink, soaking through the records of 3 months of illicit transactions. The numbers blurred into useless black smears. Silence descended on the room, heavier than the rain outside. Chloe stood frozen, her chest heaving. The empty mug rolled across the desk, a hollow mocking sound, before dropping onto the carpet with a dull thud. Victor stared at the ruined ledger. Hours of meticulous decoding vital records, linking his shell corporations to the dock foreman, gone. Irretrievable. A sudden cold rage settled in his chest, freezing out the exhaustion. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of a street thug. It was the absolute sub-zero fury of a man who held power over life and death. He slowly stood up. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, carrying the quiet, lethal grace of his violent past, hidden beneath a bespoke charcoal suit. "Mr. Russo," Chloe whispered, taking a step back. "I can dry it. I have a towel." "Stop." His voice was barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a straight razor. She clamped her mouth shut. Her hands were shaking violently now. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the dripping, ruined book. "It's your account, sir. I'm so sorry. I tripped. It's 3 weeks of my life. It's the operational security of 100 men." He walked around the desk, his expensive shoes making no sound on the wet rug. He stopped inches from her. She shrank back, her chin tucked to her chest, the picture of a terrified working-class civilian, realizing she just crossed a man she intuitively knew was dangerous. Victor looked down at her. He saw the frayed collar of her uniform, the nervous flush creeping up her neck. For a split second, he felt a flicker of pity. She was just a clumsy minimum-wage girl trying to survive in a brutal city. He extinguished the pity immediately. Survival in his world meant cutting off dead weight before it dragged you under. "Get your coat," Victor said, turning his back on her. "Please, Mr. Russo, I need this job. My rent. You have 5 minutes to clear out your locker." He walked to the window, staring out at the rain. "If you are still in this building when the clock strikes 1, I will have security physically throw you onto the pavement. Your final paycheck will be mailed to whatever pathetic address you put on your application. Leave." He didn't turn around until he heard the heavy oak door click shut. Victor stood in the quiet office, rubbing his eyes. He felt a headache morphing into a full-blown migraine. He walked back to the desk, pinching the corner of the soaking ledger, lifting it like a dead animal. It was a total loss. He threw it into the trash can. As he reached for a wad of paper towels to wipe down the mahogany surface, his eye caught a glint of metal near the leg of his chair. He knelt. It was a small silver object wedged where the carpet met the desk. Chloe must have dropped it when she scrambled away. Victor picked it up. It wasn't a hairpin. It wasn't a cheap trinket. It was a custom-molded, high-frequency audio transmitter. A bug. And not standard police issue. It was military-grade, the kind that cost more than Chloe would make in 5 lifetimes. Victor's blood ran cold. The quiet, pathetic Maid hadn't tripped over a wire. She had intentionally destroyed the ledger. Silence in the penthouse took on a different texture. Before, it was the quiet of a late night in the corporate world. Now it was the heavy, suffocating silence of a hunter realizing he had been sharing a cage with a predator. Victor stood perfectly still, the silver transmitter resting in the palm of his hand. It was no larger than a button, sleek and dense. He turned it over. Scratched onto the smooth back, barely visible to the naked eye, was a tiny emblem. A hawk with its wings spread. The Falcone crest. His mind snapped back through the last 3 months. Every dropped tray, every clumsy stumble, every time she accidentally unplugged the router while vacuuming. She wasn't inept. She was systematic. Every accident happened precisely when his lieutenants were calling in. Every time she bumped into his desk, she was planting or retrieving these devices. And tonight, the coffee. She didn't ruin the ledger out of clumsiness. The ledger contained the shipping dates for the incoming artillery, the exact artillery he intended to use to wipe the remaining Falcone loyalists off the map. She destroyed the hard copy to buy her people time. "Son of a bitch," Victor breathed. The words tasted like ash. He lunged for his desk phone, and hit the speed dial for his head of security. "Dominic, the maid, Chloe. Where is she?" "Just walked out the front doors, boss." Dominic's gravelly voice came through the speaker. "Looked like she was crying. You sack her. Lock down the building. Send 2 men out into the street right now. Bring her back upstairs. Do not let her get into a cab. Do not let her down into the subway. Bring her to me. Boss, it's pouring out there." "Do it," Victor roared, slamming the receiver down. He didn't wait. He crossed the room, ripped open a false panel in the mahogany walling, and pulled out a suppressed pistol, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. He moved to the bank of security monitors on the far wall. His fingers flew across the keyboard, rewinding the lobby footage. The screen flickered, showing the high-definition feed of the ground floor. There was Chloe walking toward the revolving doors. She looked exactly as she had upstairs, hunched shoulders, wiping her eyes, the picture of a fired, desperate employee. Dominic's men, 2 bulky enforcers in dark suits, intercepted her just as she pushed through the glass doors onto the rain-slicked pavement. Victor leaned closer to the monitor, his knuckles turning white on the edge of the console. The audio feed was muffled by the rain, but he could see Dominic's men reaching for her arms, trying to steer her back inside. She shrank away, throwing her hands up defensively. It looked like panic. But Victor wasn't looking at the broad strokes anymore. He was watching her footwork. As the larger man grabbed her left wrist, Chloe didn't try to yank it back, a natural human instinct. Instead, she stepped into his guard. Her right foot pivoted, dropping her center of gravity. In a fraction of a second, her posture transformed from a cowering maid into a coiled spring. Victor watched in cold fascination as her free hand snapped up. It wasn't a punch. It was a precise, calculated strike to the soft tissue of the man's throat. The enforcer gagged, dropping her wrist. The second man reached inside his jacket for his weapon. Chloe didn't run. She ducked under his reaching arm, grabbed the lapels of his jacket, and used his own forward momentum to hurl his 200-pound frame directly into the thick glass of the revolving door. The glass spider-webbed violently. She didn't even look back. She adjusted the collar of her cheap coat, turned on her heel, and vanished into the curtain of heavy rain. The entire altercation took less than 4 seconds. Victor hit pause. The screen froze on a blurred frame of her face just before she turned away. The terrified, submissive mask was gone. Her eyes were flat dead and entirely calculating. "Katerina," Victor whispered to the empty room. It was a ghost story the older bosses told over cigars. The old man Falcone didn't just have sons. He had a daughter sent away to Europe, trained not to lead the family from a boardroom, but to dismantle enemies from the inside. A phantom. Nobody knew what she looked like as an adult. They only knew her reputation. He had let her dust his office. He had let her make his coffee. He had let her stand behind him while he negotiated multi-million-dollar hits. His phone buzzed. It was Dominic. "Boss." Dominic coughed, sounding breathless and pained. She got away. She's not a normal civilian, Victor. She broke Paul's windpipe." "Call an ambulance for Paul," Victor said, his voice entirely devoid of panic. The rage was gone, replaced by a hyper-focused, chilling clarity. "Pull every file the agency sent us on Chloe Bennett. I want the fake background, the fake references, everything. Tear her locker apart." "What are we looking for?" "A ghost," Victor said. He hung up. He walked back to the ruined ledger, the smell of burnt coffee still hanging in the air. He realized now she hadn't been trembling out of fear when he fired her. She had been trembling from the adrenaline of a successful mission. She had played him flawlessly. Victor looked out at the sprawling, rain-soaked city. Out there in the dark, the heir to the Falcone Empire was disappearing into the shadows. And for the first time in 10 years, Victor Russo felt a genuine electric thrill of danger. She thought she had won by escaping. She didn't realize she had just given him a reason to burn the entire city down to find her. Fluorescent lights buzzed a low, irritating hum in the basement locker room of Russo Logistics. The air down here always smelled of industrial floor wax and stale sweat, a sharp contrast to the filtered, climate-controlled oxygen of the penthouse. Victor stood in front of locker number 42. Its cheap tin door hung open, the padlock snapped clean off by Dominic's bolt cutters. Dominic hovered a few feet back, pressing a bag of crushed ice against his ribs. He breathed in shallow, carefully measured gasps. Victor said nothing. He reached into the narrow metal compartment. It was empty. Almost. A standard-issue grey uniform hung neatly on a wire hanger. A pair of scuffed white orthotic sneakers sat perfectly parallel on the bottom shelf. A plastic name tag reading Chloe rested on the top rack next to a half-empty bottle of generic lemon hand lotion. That was it. No purse, no keys, no lint. Agency sent over her file. Dominic grunted, leaning heavily against the cinder-block wall. Background check cleared 3 months ago. Orphan out of foster care, 2 previous domestic cleaning jobs, spotless record. Landlord at her apartment complex says she pays rent in cash on the 1st of the month. Keeps to herself. Victor picked up one of the sneakers. It was heavy. Too heavy. He dug his thumb into the thick rubber sole and applied pressure. The seam didn't bend. It separated. He wedged his fingers into the crack and ripped the sole entirely off the shoe. Beneath the cheap exterior was a custom-milled carbon fiber plate designed to silence footsteps and distribute weight evenly. You didn't buy those in a strip mall. You ordered them from military contractors in Belgium. The background is fabricated, Victor said, dropping the ruined shoe onto the linoleum floor. The agency was paid off, or she hacked their database and inserted her own ghost profile. Send someone to the apartment anyway. It'll be empty, but I want it scrubbed for DNA, fingerprints, hair follicles, anything. Victor, she broke Paul's windpipe with 2 fingers. She threw a 200-pound man through reinforced glass. We aren't dealing with a corporate spy. I know exactly what we are dealing with, Victor replied, his voice dropping an octave. He picked up the bottle of hand lotion. He unscrewed the cap and held it to his nose. It smelled like cheap lemon, yes, but underneath it was a faint, sterile trace of something chemical. He poured a small drop onto the metal bench and touched his lighter to it. The liquid didn't boil. It flared instantly, burning with a bright, smokeless blue flame. Napalm accelerant, disguised as hand lotion. She had been walking around his headquarters with enough explosive catalyst to level the entire executive floor, smelling like a fresh kitchen. A cold smirk touched the corner of Victor's mouth. It wasn't amusement. It was the terrifying recognition of an equal. Caterina Falcone, Victor murmured, watching the blue flame die out. Dominic choked on his breath, pulling the ice pack away from his ribs. Falcone, the old man's daughter. That's a myth. She's supposed to be in Geneva or dead. She's neither. She's been making my coffee for 90 days. Victor turned around, his dark eyes locking onto his head of security. Think about it, Dominic. The missing shipments, the vanishing lieutenants. We thought the Northern Syndicate was getting lucky. They weren't. She was giving them our blind spots. Dominic looked sick. She had access to everything. She cleaned the boardroom. She took out the trash in the server room. She didn't care about the servers, Victor said, stepping past him toward the stairwell. She cared about the physical ledger. She knew I didn't trust digital records for the port operations. She waited until the exact night I was reconciling the armory shipments to spill a cup of boiling liquid over the only hard copy. So what's the play? We go to war with the North? No. Victor paused with his hand on the heavy steel door of the stairwell. The North is fractured. They take orders, but they don't have the brains to coordinate this kind of infiltration. Caterina is the brain. If we cut off the head, the rest of the Falcone loyalists will scatter like roaches. Victor pushed the door open, the sterile basement air rushing past him. He didn't just want her dead. That would be too easy. She had violated his sanctuary. She had watched him in his most vulnerable moments, feigning terror while secretly holding a knife to his throat. She had played the clumsy, pathetic girl, and he had pitied her. That was the unforgivable sin. "Put every man we have on the streets," Victor ordered as he climbed the concrete stairs. "Lock down the transit hubs, the private airstrips, the helipads. Bribe the harbour master to freeze all outbound maritime traffic. She won't leave the city without checking in with her handlers." "And when we find her," Dominic asked, struggling to keep up. "You don't touch her," Victor said, not looking back. "You corner her, and then you call me. I am going to tear the ghost apart with my bare hands." He reached the ground floor and strode out into the lobby. The shattered glass of the revolving door had already been swept up, leaving a cold, gaping hole that let the rain blow inside. Victor stood in the threshold, letting the freezing mist hit his face. He inhaled deeply, tasting the ozone and the wet asphalt. She was out there, and she was going to learn that a ghost is only scary until you turn on the lights. Rainwater cascaded from the rusted lip of the fire escape, soaking through the shoulders of Caterina's cheap wool coat. She didn't shiver. Shivering wasted energy, and right now she was running on a rapidly depleting reserve of adrenaline and sheer willpower. She shoved her shoulder against the warped wood of the rooftop access door. It groaned, giving way with a loud crack that echoed across the empty tar-papered roof. She slipped inside, kicking the door shut, and sliding a heavy steel deadbolt into place in total darkness. This safe house wasn't on any grid. It was an abandoned boiler room atop a condemned garment factory in the meatpacking district. Nobody came up here except feral cats and the occasional squatter whom she had aggressively relocated 2 weeks prior. Caterina leaned her back against the damp brick wall and finally let her lungs expand fully. "Damn it," she whispered into the dark. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small tactical flashlight, clicking it on with her thumb. The narrow beam cut through the dust, illuminating a sparse setup, a military cot, a footlocker, and a camping stove. She stripped off the wet coat, letting it drop to the concrete floor. Beneath it, she wore a tight black tactical turtleneck and dark cargo pants. The oversized, frumpy Maid uniform she had worn for 3 months was gone discarded in an alleyway dumpster miles away. Caterina walked over to the footlocker and popped the latches. She needed to assess the damage. Rolling up her left sleeve, she inspected her forearm. A dark, ugly bruise was already blossoming from wrist to elbow, where Dominic's enforcer had grabbed her. She prodded the muscle. Nothing broken. Just deep tissue trauma. She had underestimated the speed of Victor's security response. She thought she had at least 60 seconds to clear the lobby. Victor had locked the building down in 30. He was faster than her father's old dossiers had claimed. She grabbed a bottle of rubbing alcohol and a roll of gauze from the trunk. Pouring the alcohol onto a rag, she aggressively scrubbed the remaining cheap makeup from her face. The pale, exhausted complexion of Chloe washed away, revealing high, sharp cheekbones and a cold, calculating stare that had terrified men twice her age in the European underworld. Katerina sat on the edge of the cot, wrapping her wrist tightly. Her mind replayed the scene in the penthouse. The way Victor's eyes had turned completely dead when the coffee ruined the ledger. Most bosses would have screamed. They would have thrown a glass or hit her. Victor had gone perfectly, terrifyingly still. That was what made him dangerous. He didn't let emotion dictate his violence. He controlled it. Over the last 90 days, she had studied him meticulously. She had mapped his routines, decoded his tells, and found the physical locations of his illegal shipments. But she had also seen the other side of him. She had seen him stay up for 3 days straight to negotiate a ceasefire that saved civilian lives in the harbor district. She had watched him meticulously clean his own weapons. She had noticed the way he rubbed his temple when his migraines flared up. A silent admission of human frailty. He never showed his men. She had caught herself once or twice admiring him. Katerina tightened the gauze, pulling the tape with her teeth. Admiration was a liability. He was a usurper. He had taken her family's territory, and she was here to take it back. Destroying the ledger tonight was the final step. Without those shipping schedules, his incoming weapon supply was stalled. Tomorrow night, her men would hit his vulnerable warehouses, crippling his empire permanently. She just had to survive until tomorrow. Reaching back into the trunk, she pulled out a heavily encrypted satellite phone. It took 40 seconds to find a signal through the storm and the thick brick walls. She dialed a scrambled 12-digit sequence. It rang twice. "Status." A gruff, heavily accented voice answered. It was Matteo, her father's oldest capo, currently running the northern remnants from a basement in Queens. "The ledger is destroyed," Katerina said, her voice completely devoid of the stammering hesitation she used as Chloe. "He's blind. Move on the docks at midnight tomorrow." "You took a massive risk doing it yourself," Matteo grumbled. "Did he see your face? Did he recognize you?" "No," Katerina lied. She didn't know why she lied. A strange instinct of self-preservation, perhaps. "But my cover is blown. The infiltration phase is over." "Where are you?" "Safe House Beta, Meatpacking District." Silence hung on the line for a fraction of a second too long. The hair on the back of Katerina's neck stood up. "Matteo." "Stay put, Katerina." Matteo said, his voice dropping slightly. "We're sending an extraction team. They'll be there in 20 minutes. Sit tight." The line went dead. Katerina stared at the phone. Her pulse, which had finally begun to slow down, suddenly spiked. Matteo never called it Safe House Beta. He hated operational jargon. He always called it the Butcher's Roof. And Matteo never promised an extraction team in 20 minutes. In this weather across the city, it would take 45 minutes minimum to mobilize a quiet crew. Unless they were already mobilized. Unless they were already nearby. Katerina dropped the phone on the cot. A cold, nauseating realization washed over her. The Northern Syndicate was fractured. Victor had said it himself in his boardroom meetings. They were bleeding money desperate. What if Matteo didn't want to fight a war against Russo Logistics tomorrow? What if Matteo had decided that handing over the ghost of the Falcone family to Victor Russo was a better, more lucrative peace offering? She wasn't waiting for an extraction team. She was waiting for a hit squad. Katerina moved instantly. She didn't bother packing the trunk. She grabbed a fully loaded Glock 19, racked the slide, and shoved it into the holster at her lower back. She snatched a spare magazine and slid it into her pocket. A heavy metallic thud echoed from the floor below. Someone had just kicked open the street-level access door. They weren't using stealth. They were moving fast. She killed the flashlight, plunging the room back into absolute darkness. She walked silently to the heavy steel door she had just bolted, pressing her ear against the freezing metal. Footsteps, heavy boots echoing on the concrete stairs. 5, maybe 6 men. Coming up fast. Katerina gripped the handle of her gun. She was the heir to an empire, but right now, trapped on a roof in the pouring rain, she was just a rat in a cage. And the water was rising. Rain battered the rusted tin of the roof in heavy, punishing sheets. Katerina backed away from the reinforced door, her boots making absolutely no sound on the wet concrete. 6 men in a bottleneck stairwell. She had one 15-round magazine in her weapon and a spare in her pocket. Mathematically, she could drop them if they filed in one by one. But hit squads didn't knock politely. They breached, flooded the zone, and sprayed lead until nothing moved. She needed an equalizer. Her eyes darted to the camping stove resting near the footlocker. Attached to it was a small green propane cylinder. It wasn't C4, but in a confined, poorly ventilated boiler room, rapid gas expansion didn't care about the difference. She grabbed the cylinder, unscrewed the brass fitting, and listened to the sharp hiss of escaping gas. The smell of rotten eggs immediately filled the damp air, thick and nauseating. She rolled the hissing tank directly toward the base of the heavy metal door. "Stack up," a muffled voice commanded from the other side of the steel. Katerina retreated to the far corner of the room, crouching behind a massive cast-iron water heater. She raised her Glock, resting her wrists on the rusted pipe to stabilize her aim. Her finger slipped inside the trigger guard. She breathed in, holding the icy air in her lungs. A heavy boot kicked the door. The deadbolt groaned, but held. "Breaching," the voice growled. A deafening blast shattered the lock. The door flew inward, rebounding violently off the brick wall. 2 men in dark raincoats poured into the threshold. Assault rifles raised, sweeping the dark room with under-barrel flashlights. Katerina didn't aim for the men. She aimed for the invisible cloud of gas pooling around their ankles. She squeezed the trigger twice. The muzzle flash ignited the concentrated propane. A terrifying whoosh sucked the oxygen out of the room, followed instantly by a concussive shockwave of orange fire. The explosion blew the 2-point men backward into the stairwell, their clothes catching the flash burn. Their screams echoed down the concrete shaft. Katerina didn't wait for the smoke to clear. She broke from cover, sprinting toward the gaping doorway. A 3rd man staggered into the frame, coughing his weapon aimed blindly into the black smoke. Katerina didn't slow down. She drove the palm of her hand upward, smashing his nose into his brain pan, and ripped the rifle from his grip as he dropped. She stepped over his twitching body, stepping out onto the external fire escape, rather than taking the stairs. The iron grate was slick with rain and moss. Below her, a 6-story drop into a narrow, garbage-choked alleyway. Bullets pinged off the brick wall inches from her head. The remaining men in the stairwell were firing blindly through the smoke. Sharp splinters of brick dusted her cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. Katerina swung her leg over the railing. The adjacent building was an old meat-packing plant, its flat gravel roof about 10 feet across the alley, but 3 floors lower. A terrifying, uncontrolled drop. Another burst of automatic fire chewed through the iron railing where her hand had just been. She didn't look down. She just pushed off the iron ledge and jumped. Gravity yanked her downward in a stomach-churning freefall. The dark alley blurred past her peripheral vision. She hit the gravel roof of the neighboring building hard. Too hard. Her boots struck the loose stones, but her forward momentum sent her tumbling violently. Her shoulder slammed into a raised ventilation duct with a sickening crunch. Pain blinding and white-hot spiked through her left side. She gasped, all the air violently expelled from her lungs. She rolled into the shadow of the duct, clutching her arm to her chest. Above her, flashlights cut through the rain, sweeping the alley. "Where is she?" a voice yelled from the higher roof. Check the street. She couldn't have jumped that. Katerina gritted her teeth, tasting the metallic tang of copper in her mouth. She had bitten her tongue during the impact. Her left shoulder was dislocated. The arm hung useless and heavy at her side. She pressed her back against the cold, wet metal of the vent. The rain washed the blood from her face, mixing with the dirt and gravel. Matteo. The betrayal burned worse than the torn ligaments in her shoulder. She had spent 10 years training in the cold mountains of Switzerland, preparing to reclaim her father's legacy. She had bled for the Falcone name, and the moment she created the perfect opening, her own general sold her out to the highest bidder. She wasn't just a rat in a cage anymore. She was a ghost without a haunting ground. She awkwardly unholstered her pistol with her right hand, checking the chamber with her thumb. 12 rounds left. No allies. No safe house. There! A voice shouted from a nearby fire escape. A beam of light pinned her against the vent. Roof below, I've got her. Katerina raised her gun, squinting against the blinding halogen glare. She squeezed the trigger. The light shattered, and the man holding it tumbled backward down the iron stairs with a wet thud. But there were more coming. She could hear the heavy boots echoing on the metal walkways descending rapidly. They were swarming the block. She dragged herself upright, using the vent for support. Every movement sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her gut. She stumbled toward the roof access door of the meat-packing plant. It was padlocked. She aimed her pistol at the heavy brass lock, turning her face away, and fired. The lock shattered. She kicked the door open and plunged into the pitch-black stairwell descending into the belly of the abandoned factory. It smelled of old blood and rust. Fitting. She needed to find a place to pop her shoulder back into the socket. She needed a tourniquet. She needed a miracle. Because if Matteo's men didn't kill her in this factory, Victor Russio's men were waiting on the streets to finish the job. Victor stepped out of the black armored SUV, the soles of his bespoke Oxfords splashing directly into a deep puddle of murky rainwater. He didn't care. His dark eyes were fixed on the flashing red and blue lights cordoning off the mouth of the alleyway in the meat-packing district. Dominic flanked him, holding a massive black umbrella that shielded Victor from the worst of the downpour. Cops got a 911 call about an explosion 10 minutes ago, Dominic said, reading off a glowing tablet. Our guys intercepted the dispatch, paid the local precinct captain to keep his uniforms out on the perimeter. The alley is ours for the next 20 minutes. Who is inside? Victor asked, his voice, a low, dangerous rumble. Not us, Dominic replied. And not cops. We found 3 bodies in the stairwell of that condemned boiler room. 2 burned, one with his face caved in. Victor bypassed the yellow police tape, walking into the narrow, garbage-strewn alley. The smell of cordite and burnt flesh hung heavy in the damp air, overpowering the usual stench of decaying trash. He stopped next to a crumpled shape, resting on a pile of broken pallets. It was a man in a dark tactical coat, his neck bent at a totally unnatural angle. Victor nudged the man's chin with the toe of his shoe, turning the face upward. He recognized the heavy crude ink tattooed on the corpse's neck, a serpent wrapping around a dagger. Matteo's crew, Victor said softly. He looked up at the rusted fire escapes, crisscrossing the brick walls above them. The Northern Syndicate, Dominic frowned, shining a flashlight onto the dead man. Why would Matteo hit his own boss? The girl just risked her neck to cripple your shipping lines for him. Because Matteo is a businessman, Victor said, stepping over the body. A coward, but a businessman. He saw the ledger burn, but he also knows I locked down the city. He realized a war with me tomorrow would cost him too much blood. So he decided to serve me the one thing I want on a silver platter to buy his own peace. Victor traced the trajectory of the broken fire escape above, then looked across the alley to the lower roof of the abandoned meatpacking plant. "She jumped," Victor murmured. The sheer physical impossibility of the leap made a twisted knot of respect tighten in his chest. She made that gap. He walked toward the loading dock of the meatpacking plant. A rusted service door hung open on busted hinges, the lock shot to pieces. On the concrete threshold, a distinct smear of dark, wet blood was slowly washing away in the rain. "Get the men to surround this building," Victor ordered, unbuttoning his suit jacket and drawing his suppressed pistol. "Nobody goes in but me." "Victor, she's a cornered animal right now. Let the boys sweep the floor." "No." Victor locked eyes with his head of security. The absolute freezing authority in his gaze made Dominic step back. "She made me look like a fool in my own house. I'm going to look her in the eye when this ends." Victor stepped through the busted door into the cavernous, pitch-black interior of the factory. The air inside was freezing, smelling of ammonia and decades of decay. Rain dripped steadily through holes in the high, vaulted ceiling, echoing loudly in the empty space. He moved with absolute silence, a predator hunting in his natural element. He followed the faint, erratic droplets of blood across the cracked tile floor. They led toward the old industrial freezers in the back. He paused outside the heavy stainless steel door of freezer number 4. It was cracked open, just a fraction of an inch. Victor pressed his back against the wall. He reached out with his left hand and yanked the heavy door open, pivoting into the doorway with his weapon raised and centered. "I'd shoot, but my hands are shaking too badly to guarantee a headshot." A quiet, strained voice echoed from the dark corner of the insulated room. Victor didn't lower his gun. He activated the tactical light mounted beneath the barrel. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating Katerina. She was sitting on the floor, leaning against a rusted meat hook rail. Her left arm was strapped tightly to her chest with a makeshift sling made from a torn strip of her black turtleneck. Her face was pale, smeared with dirt and dried blood, but her dark eyes were wide open, staring directly into the blinding light. Her right hand held the Glock resting on her knee, pointed loosely in his direction. She looked utterly exhausted, defeated, and yet entirely unbowed. "You found the rat in the rain, Mr. Russo," she whispered, a bitter, cynical smile touching her lips. "Congratulations." Victor kept the light on her face. "Drop the weapon, Katerina." "Or what?" She laughed, a dry, painful sound that ended in a wince. "You'll kill me. I think we both know I'm not walking out of this freezer. Matteo made sure of that." "Matteo sold you out. Brilliant deduction. Did you figure that out all by yourself, or did your accounting department run the numbers?" Victor finally lowered his weapon, clicking off the blinding light. The dim, ambient light from the factory floor spilled into the freezer, casting long shadows. "He sent a 6-man hit squad to execute you," Victor said, his voice stripped of the explosive rage he had felt hours ago. Now, looking at her broken on the floor, he felt something far more dangerous. Intrigue. "He thought handing me your corpse would buy him an amnesty deal." Katerina's grip on her pistol tightened. "So finish the job. Take my head back to your penthouse and put it on a pike. It's what you came for." Victor stared at her. He saw the girl who had clumsily poured his coffee. He saw the ghost who had dismantled his security. And now he saw a betrayed soldier with nowhere left to run. "Matteo insulted me," Victor said, quietly holstering his gun. "He thinks he can burn my ledger, use my city as a battleground, and then dictate the terms of peace by throwing me a bone. I don't take scraps from cowards." Katerina frowned, confusion cutting through her pain. "What are you saying?" Victor took a step closer, towering over her in the dark. "I'm saying you are currently unemployed, Chloe," Victor said, extending a perfectly manicured hand toward her. "And I have a vacancy for someone who knows how to break a man's windpipe. You want revenge on the man who sold your family out. Get up. We have work to do." Blood dripped from Katerina's fingertips, pooling on the cracked floor tiles of the industrial freezer. She stared at Victor's outstretched hand. It was a flawless hand. Uncalloused, steady the crisp white cuff of a $1,000 shirt perfectly aligned beneath the tailored wool of his suit jacket. It was the hand of a man who commanded violence from a safe distance. But tonight, he was standing in the dark, surrounded by the smell of cordite and copper, offering a lifeline to his worst enemy. She laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound that rattled painfully in her chest. She let the Glock slide from her grip, the heavy polymer clattering against the metal grate. "You don't want a maid. Victor," she whispered, her chin dropping slightly, as a fresh wave of exhaustion hit her. "I have enough people to clean my floors," Victor replied smoothly, stepping closer. He didn't lower his hand. "I need someone who can burn a house down from the inside, and you need an army to deal with Matteo. Take the deal, Katerina, or bleed out next to a rusted meat hook." She knew it was a devil's bargain. Men like Victor Russo didn't offer salvation out of the goodness of their hearts. He wanted her strategic mind. He wanted her knowledge of the Northern Syndicate's infrastructure. Most of all, he wanted the legitimacy of the Falcone bloodline marching beside him when he wiped Matteo off the map. But right now, principles were a luxury she couldn't afford. Katerina reached up with her good right arm and gripped his forearm. His grip was iron. He didn't just help her stand, he practically hauled her upright. White-hot agony ripped through her left shoulder. Her vision whited out for a terrifying second, and her knees buckled. Victor caught her instinctively, his free arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her against his chest. She smelled his cologne cedar and cold rain cutting through the stench of the slaughterhouse. "Breathe," he ordered, his voice vibrating against her ear. "It's dislocated," she hissed through gritted teeth, her forehead resting heavily against his expensive lapel. She was leaving a smear of dirt and blood on the charcoal wool, but he didn't seem to care. "I know. We'll fix it in the car." He adjusted his grip, practically carrying half her body weight. "Walk with me." They moved slowly out of the freezer, crossing the dark expanse of the factory floor. Every step sent a jolt of fire through Katerina's nerves, but she forced herself to keep moving, matching Victor's long, measured strides as best she could. When they finally stepped out of the loading dock into the alleyway, the rain had reduced to a freezing drizzle. Dominic was waiting by the black armored SUV, his hand resting casually on his hip near his holster. When he saw Victor emerge from the shadows, supporting the woman who had just crippled half their operation, his jaw locked. "Boss," Dominic warned, taking a step forward. "Tell me you're bringing her out here to shoot her. Open the back door, Dominic." Victor said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. Dominic stared at Katerina. She met his gaze with dead, flat eyes, leaning heavily against Victor. Dominic muttered a curse under his breath and yanked the heavy, reinforced door open. Victor helped her into the back seat, easing her onto the plush leather before climbing in beside her. Dominic got behind the wheel, slamming his door with unnecessary force. "Drive to the Brooklyn townhouse," Victor commanded. "Take the bridges. I want a perimeter set up before we arrive." The SUV pulled away from the curb, leaving the flashing police lights and the bodies behind. The interior of the car was warm, smelling of rich leather and the faint ozone of the air conditioning. Katerina slumped against the tinted window, her breathing shallow. The adrenaline was fading rapidly and shock was beginning to claw its way in. Her skin felt like ice. Victor reached into a hidden compartment under the center console and pulled out a heavy medical kit. He unzipped it, extracting a pair of heavy shears and a roll of white athletic tape. "Sit forward," he said. She obeyed blindly. Victor slid the shears beneath the blood-soaked fabric of her tactical turtleneck and cut cleanly up the seam. He peeled the ruined fabric back, exposing her bruised, swollen shoulder. The joint was visibly deformed, the bone protruding sharply against the pale skin. Victor's fingers, surprisingly gentle, probed the surrounding muscle. Katerina flinched, biting her lip so hard she tasted fresh blood. Matteo's men didn't do this. Victor noted quietly, his eyes focused entirely on the injury. "I fell," she managed to say. "Missed the jump." "You made a 30-foot lateral jump in the rain. Most men would have broken their necks." Victor picked up a thick leather wallet from the console and pressed it against her mouth. "Bite down." She took the leather between her teeth. She knew what was coming. Victor placed his left hand firmly against her ribcage, anchoring her to the seat. His right hand gripped her elbow. He didn't count down. He didn't offer a hollow warning. He simply applied a sudden violent torque, pulling the arm outward and twisting. A sickening pop echoed in the quiet cabin. Katerina screamed into the leather, her eyes rolling back as a blinding flash of agony hijacked her nervous system. She blindly grabbed Victor's thigh with her right hand, her nails digging viciously through his trousers. He didn't flinch. The pain immediately shifted, dulling from a sharp, agonizing spike into a deep, throbbing ache. The joint was back in place. She spat the wallet out her chest, heaving as she gasped for air. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mixing with the grime. Victor calmly reached for the tape. "Better." "Go to hell," she breathed, though the color was already starting to return to her cheeks. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of Victor's mouth. "We're already there, Katerina. Now sit still while I bind this, or you'll pop it right back out when we raid Matteo's compound." She let her head fall back against the headrest, watching him work. His hands were precise, wrapping the tape tightly around her shoulder to restrict the movement. He wasn't looking at her like a maid anymore. He was looking at her like a weapon he had just meticulously repaired. And heaven help her, she was starting to look at him the same way. Dawn broke over Brooklyn in a wash of grey, bruised clouds. The safe house was a fortified brownstone, tucked away in a quiet, affluent neighborhood. Inside, the heavy velvet drapes were drawn tight, and the air hummed with the quiet efficiency of Victor's surviving lieutenants, running logistics from the downstairs dining room. Katerina sat in the upstairs study. She was wearing an oversized black crewneck sweater she had found in a dresser, her left arm strapped firmly to her chest in a proper sling. The hot shower had washed away the blood and the physical remnants of Chloe, leaving only Katerina. She felt lighter, deadlier, and entirely exhausted. The heavy mahogany door clicked open. Victor walked in, holding 2 steaming ceramic mugs. He had changed into a dark turtleneck and black trousers, stripping away the corporate CEO aesthetic for something much more functional. He set one mug down on the glass coffee table in front of her. "Black," Victor said. "Try not to spill this one." Katerina picked up the mug with her good hand, letting the heat seep into her cold fingers. "You'll never let the ledger go, will you?" It was a handmade Italian binding. Victor replied completely deadpan, sitting on the leather sofa opposite her. He took a sip of his own coffee, his dark eyes studying her over the rim. "We have a problem. Matteo. My scouts hit his basement in Queens an hour ago. It was completely scrubbed. Servers ripped out, paper trails burned. He knew I'd come for him the second the hit squad failed. He's gone to ground." Katerina took a slow sip of her coffee. The bitterness grounded her. She leaned forward, placing the mug back on the glass table. Matteo is a creature of habit, Katerina said, her voice sharp, devoid of any lingering weakness. He projects strength, but he's deeply paranoid. He never trusted the Queen's location. He only used it for day-to-day operations because it was close to the transit hubs. Then where is his bunker? Newark, she said without hesitation. There's an abandoned commercial shipping yard on the edge of the industrial sector. My father bought it 15 years ago through a blind trust. Matteo repurposed it when he took over the northern faction. He keeps his heavy artillery there, and more importantly, he keeps his private flight manifests there. Victor set his mug down. The air in the room shifted. This was the intelligence he had been bleeding money and men for months trying to uncover, and she had just handed it to him over morning coffee. You knew this the entire time you were dusting my office, Victor said, leaning back, a dark fascination creeping into his tone. Of course I did. I built the security protocols for that yard when I was 22. Katerina met his gaze, head on. The perimeter is ringed with motion sensors, but they have a 3-second delay designed to prevent false alarms from stray dogs. The reinforced gate is manual secured from the inside. He'll have 20 men minimum inside the main warehouse. If you hit the front, they'll chew your crew to pieces with suppressing fire, while Matteo takes the underground utility tunnel to a waiting chopper. So we don't hit the front. We hit the roof, Katerina said. The skylights are frosted, reinforced glass, but the structural integrity of the steel framing is compromised by rust. I noted it in a report 5 years ago. Matteo is too cheap to fix infrastructure. We drop in from above, bypass the perimeter sensors completely, and cut off the utility tunnel before he even realizes we're inside. Victor stared at her. The silence stretched between them, thick and electric. For 3 months she had been a shadow in the corner of his eye. A clumsy, timid girl who bumped into furniture and stuttered when spoken to. Now, looking at the sharp, ruthless tactician sitting across from him, he realized he had never actually seen her until this exact moment. You are a terrifying woman, Katerina, Victor murmured softly. You don't survive in this family by being pleasant, Victor. He stood up, walking over to a heavy wooden desk in the corner of the room. He unlocked the top drawer and pulled out a sleek black object. He walked back to her and placed it on the glass table next to her coffee mug. It was a compact Sig Sauer P365, chambered in 9 millimeters. Clean, perfectly oiled, and entirely untraceable. We move at midnight, Victor said, his eyes locking onto hers. Dominic will lead the distraction team at the front gate. You and I are taking the roof. If Matteo makes it to that tunnel, he disappears forever. I am not letting that happen. Katerina looked at the weapon, then up at Victor. You're trusting me with a loaded gun at your back. I'm trusting that you hate him more than you hate me. Victor leaned over the table, his face inches from hers. The proximity was deliberate, a sudden, intense gravitational pull. And I'm trusting that when you pull the trigger, you won't miss. Katerina didn't pull away. She reached out her fingers, curling around the cold, textured grip of the Sig. It felt right. I never miss, Victor, she whispered. I just play the long game. Then the game ends tonight. Victor straightened up, adjusting the cuffs of his sweater. Rest up, Ghost. We're going hunting. Wind tore off the harbor, carrying the scent of industrial exhaust. High above the rusted Newark shipping yard, Victor and Katerina lay flat against the corrugated roof of the primary warehouse. Rain had given way to a heavy fog, masking their approach. Victor checked his watch. 11:59. Beside him, Katerina was pressed against the wet steel, her left arm secured tightly beneath her jacket. Her right hand gripped the Sig Sauer with terrifying stillness. She didn't shiver. Her breathing was slow, measured, and predatory. 10 seconds, Victor whispered. He traced the edge of the skylight panel they had bypassed the motion sensors to reach. As she described, the iron frame was eaten through with rust. Katerina nodded, shifting her weight onto her knees. Below, a massive explosion shattered the midnight quiet. A flash of orange illuminated the fog, followed by the deafening rattle of automatic gunfire. Dominic had driven a rigged sedan into the front gates, drawing the attention of every guard in the compound. Shouts echoed from the yard. Heavy boots hammered against the concrete inside the warehouse. "Now," Victor commanded. He swung a heavy pry bar into the rusted joint of the skylight. The metal snapped with a sharp crack. Victor gripped the frame and heaved backward, ripping the panel free. He didn't hesitate, dropping through the hole into the pitch-black rafters. Katerina followed an instant later. She landed awkwardly on the steel I-beam, a sharp hiss escaping her teeth as the impact jarred her bound shoulder. Victor caught her waist, stabilizing her before she could slip, pulling her flush against his chest in the dark. Below them, the warehouse floor was a chaotic ant farm. Men in tactical gear sprinted toward the front loading bays, their weapons drawn completely, ignoring the ceiling. "Utility tunnel," Victor murmured, his breath brushing her ear. Katerina pointed with the barrel of her pistol toward the far northern corner. "Behind the rusted shipping containers, the electrical box is a dummy door." They moved silently along the catwalks, shadows hunting in the industrial gloom. By the time they reached the metal stairs descending into the northern corner, the warehouse was mostly empty, the guards fully engaged in the brutal firefight at the perimeter. But not Matteo. A heavy grating sound echoed from the corner. The dummy electrical box swung open, revealing a dimly lit concrete tunnel. Two massive enforcers flanked the entrance, their assault rifles sweeping the empty floor. Between them stood Matteo. He wore a rumpled trench coat, clutching a thick leather briefcase to his chest, his face pale and slick with panicked sweat. Victor descended the stairs in absolute silence, drawing his suppressed pistol. He tapped Katerina's shoulder, holding up 2 fingers, then pointing to the guard on the left. She gave a single curt nod. They stepped out from behind the rusted shipping containers simultaneously. Victor fired twice. The hollow cough of the suppressor was barely audible over the distant gunfire. The guard on the left crumpled his knees, giving out instantly. Before the second guard could swing his rifle, Katerina raised the SIG. Shooting one-handed, her stance compromised by the sling, she aimed for the throat. The sharp crack of her unsuppressed weapon shattered the immediate silence. The man dropped his rifle, clutching his ruined neck as he collapsed. Matteo froze. The briefcase slipped from his sweaty fingers, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. He stared down the barrel of Katerina's smoking gun. "Katerina." Matteo choked out his eyes wide, darting from her to the towering, lethal presence of Victor Russo, stepping out of the shadows. "You were dead." "I learned how to fall, Matteo," Katerina said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. She stepped forward, her boots crunching over the scattered brass casings on the floor. "Listen to me," Matteo pleaded, backing up until his shoulders hit the concrete tunnel entrance. He looked at Victor. "Russo, whatever she promised you, I can double it. The routes, the European contacts. It's all in the briefcase. You don't need this ghost. She's a liability." Victor stopped a few feet away, casually lowering his weapon. He slipped his free hand into his pocket, looking at Matteo with absolute freezing contempt. "You burned my ledger, Matteo," Victor said softly. "You sent men into my city. And worst of all, you thought you could use her as a bargaining chip. Victor turned his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto Katerina. She isn't a liability. She's the only person in this city who actually terrifies me. And I respect that. Matteo swallowed hard, turning his desperate gaze back to the woman he had betrayed. Katerina, I kept the family alive. Your father was weak. I did what I had to do to survive. We are family. Family doesn't lock the cage and strike a match, Katerina replied. She didn't monologue. She didn't scream. She simply raised the gun, aligned the iron sights with the center of his forehead, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed violently in the cavernous space. Matteo slid down the wall, leaving a dark smear against the concrete, his lifeless eyes staring vacantly into the dark. Silence rushed back in heavy and absolute, save for the distant fading sirens. Katerina lowered the gun. Her right hand was trembling slightly, the sheer adrenaline finally burning out of her system. She stared at the man who had stolen her birthright, feeling nothing but a cold, hollow finality. It was over. The ghost had her revenge. Suddenly she felt the warmth of Victor's hand wrapping over hers. He gently pried the slide-locked weapon from her stiff fingers, slipping it into his own waistband. He stepped into her space, entirely unbothered by the blood and the violence that hung thick in the air. It's done, Victor said, his voice a low, grounding rumble. He reached up his thumb, lightly brushing a streak of dirt and gunpowder from her cheekbone. It was an incredibly intimate gesture in an incredibly brutal room. Katerina looked up at him. She saw the absolute power in his posture, the ruthless ambition in his eyes, and beneath it all an undeniable possessive loyalty. She came to destroy his empire, and instead he had helped her reclaim her soul. "What now, Victor?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "Now," Victor murmured, his hand sliding to the back of her neck, pulling her just a fraction of an inch closer. "We go home. Tomorrow we buy a new ledger. And you are going to help me fill it." Katerina let out a dark, breathless laugh, leaning her forehead against his chest as the sirens grew louder. The clumsy maid was dead. The queen had arrived. What a brutal, satisfying end to Matteo's betrayal. Victor and Katerina proved that the deadliest alliances are forged in fire, and sometimes the perfect partner is the one who originally came to destroy you. Did you expect that explosive finale? If you loved this dark Mafia romance and want more intense, action-packed stories, filled with morally grey characters and razor-sharp tension, smash that like button and share this video with your fellow romance readers. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next thrilling audio drama.